Welcome to the Sanctions Age, the podcast that explores how sanctions are changing the world. My name is Esfandyar Batmanghelidj. Today's show is about how a single department in the US government has upended the world order and changed the way that wars are fought. And no, I'm not talking about the Department of Defense. Over the last few decades, the Department of Treasury has transformed from an institution that managed the dollar, oversaw government budgets, and issued bonds into an institution that plays a critical role in U.S. national security. At the heart of this transformation is a cast of characters, political appointees, and bureaucrats who realized the immense power that the U.S. government could wield through the use of sanctions, including the power to wage economic war. My guest today calls these officials paper soldiers, which is the title of her new book. Saleha Mohsin has covered the Treasury Department for Bloomberg since 2016. Her book, titled Paper Soldiers: How the Weaponization of the Dollar Changed the World Order, was published last week and draws on interviews with more than 100 current and former officials and diplomats. Saleha, thanks for coming on to the show.
I'm so excited to be here.
So your book starts and ends with the story of this one key character in your cast of characters, Bob Rubin, who was the Treasury Secretary under President Clinton. And Rubin had a sign on his desk that said, "The buck starts here." He was a proponent of a strong dollar policy, and this is a theme that you sort of trace throughout the book. Tell us a little bit about Rubin and what is a strong dollar policy?
Bob Rubin was the Treasury Secretary under Bill Clinton, the second one to serve Clinton out of three Treasury Secretaries. It was really interesting interviewing him for the book. I was in awe to be in his presence, to be honest, because he's so well known, so storied. When he joined the administration, he actually did not start as Treasury Secretary. He was the first ever director of the newly created National Economic Council, the NEC, at the White House. So he's been a trailblazer on a couple of different fronts. And when when the administration started in the early 90s, the currency markets globally were really it was an environment where anything could happen. It was kind of like the Wild West, where governments, including the US, would frequently intervene in the currency exchange rate to meddle with the value. Currency traders didn't know when the next intervention could come from what country, who's getting together. And that's because in the 70s and 80s, there was this era of governments getting together for the Plaza or the Louvre Accord to say, okay, we want to change what the terms of trade are. And that just had currency traders on edge. And so Rubin wanted to bring some calm to that whole wild regime. And so he decided, I'm going to try to make currency policy as boring as possible. So anytime someone would ask him about currency policy, he would have a very dull response. A strong dollar is in the nation's interests.
And he sort of succeeded. I mean, we ended up with a dollar that was very strong, and it led to a situation where investors around the world really saw the dollar as a safe haven that could be relied upon. But a lot of critics at the time, including in the late 90s, pointed out that this was possibly having negative effects for U.S. industry. So you write about an episode where in 1997, 1998, the steel producers in the U.S. lost a lot of market share globally. And this was all happening against the backdrop of sort of China rising as a manufacturing power. And one of the heads of a major U.S. union at the time said that, quote, "The U.S. needs to stop this strong dollar rhetoric and replace it with a sound dollar policy." So did the Clinton administration's approach to dollar policy and creating a strong dollar really undermine U.S. industry?
I think that it's too big of an event. The damage that was done in the heartland from a strong dollar. I think it's too big of an event to put the onus or the responsibility on any one person, administration, or economic policy agenda. What happened was that a strong dollar policy underpinned globalization, and globalization created some great wins, some great successes for the US and the rest of the world. But there was a sense that maybe it was the policymakers were looking at it too much as the glass half full and not realizing that there was a whole swath of America and more beyond just our borders of people who were left behind the benefits and gifts of globalization, sort of the quote-unquote forgotten man. And some of it was an oversight by policymakers who didn't focus on the expected economic scarring that would emerge from globalization as the US manufacturing sector was hollowed out because made in America was too expensive for American consumers and foreign consumers to buy compared to made in China, made in Vietnam, made in Bangladesh. The other part was that the fixes that were proposed were maybe a little naive. One proposal was that we'll retrain people, but you can't realistically take a 52-year-old person living in Moraine, Ohio, a part of the country that I take readers into in my book to talk about the benefits and losses of the strong dollar policy and globalization. You can't take someone like that and say, you've worked at a factory for half your life, but we're going to retrain you. That's not realistic. And it also doesn't account for some of the interruptions. Globalization was great. There were a lot of benefits. And when it came time to fix any of the problems, 9/11 happened. The global financial crisis happened. And so it kept being put on the back burner.
So I'd love to start with sort of that first interruption. I mean, it might have made sense for the Bush administration incoming to reevaluate some aspects of the strong dollar policy, kind of try out some of these fixes. But as you point out, early in that administration, there was this, catastrophic event in the attacks on September 11th. And suddenly the priorities shifted in terms of where U.S. financial power needed to be sort of focused. And you make a really compelling case that the war on terror didn't start with a series of airstrikes. It actually started with a package of sanctions that the George W. Bush administration brought into place around 2 weeks after September 11th. And so those sanctions and the ability to kind of use these financial tools, how connected was that to really the success of the strong dollar policy that had emerged, in the decade prior to those attacks?
I think it's twofold. One, it's not a case; it's just fact. That's how the war on terror started. Was with the stroke of a pen. On September 24th, 2001, it was a decision that George W. Bush announced in the Rose Garden, and by his side was the U.S. Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill at the time. I think the evolution sort of, or the starting point of the weaponization started first in 1944, which is a year that a lot of economists look at. There was the Bretton Woods Conference, and by design, the U.S. currency was crowned King Dollar. And it starts with that, with the U.S. becoming the owner of the world's reserve asset. But I think the Rubin, what he did was he brought calm and stability and predictability to the U.S. currency regime that was appreciated by investors. It was trusted by foreign governments. And he also brought with it, like this mythic quality to the U.S.'s dollar policy. There is this kabuki game going on. What does the current Treasury Secretary think of the dollar, where it should be? And he would say, we don't have a target in mind. No one really believed him. So it was this cat and mouse game with reporters that persisted into the Bush administration. When Paul O'Neill became Bush's first Treasury Secretary, everyone kind of waited almost with bated breath to see, would this strong dollar mantra and this new calm currency regime become bipartisan? And it did, when Paul O'Neill made a mirroring statement to what Bob Rubin said about what the U.S. dollar policy should be. So it definitely started with that. And in the book, I lay out sort of where it went from there, and also how the dollar policy had been a little bit of a problem child for Treasury secretaries, with many of them kind of seeing themselves trip over language and accidentally triggering spikes and dips in the currency exchange rate.
I think the analogy there of like a kabuki theater is also really interesting, because you do sort of write about these figures in the book as characters, and they have to play certain roles, and the roles they ended up playing became very consequential. And during the sort of global war on terror, there was a new set of characters that emerged, not necessarily Treasury secretaries, but people in working within the Treasury Department. And in particular, there was an office that you point to as being really instrumental in delivering these tools, where sanctions and other forms of economic coercion became a weapon that the U.S. could wield. And the office here is the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. And you write in particular about Stuart Levy, who was one of the officials there. And on Levy's last day, something pretty momentous happened. Last day in office before he sort of handed over to his successor, the then Obama administration, which had just come into office, seized $30 billion of assets belonging to the Gaddafi regime. They were responding to the violence that was unfolding in Libya. Why was that such a momentous occasion, and what did it represent about the emergence of the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, TFI, as this important kind of part of the institution?
Yeah, TFI was new. So, when 9/11 happened, there was no TFI. Treasury had two units. Well, it had more units, but the main ones that, as they're known today, are domestic policy, domestic finance, and then international finance. And then there were, Secret Service was part of Treasury, and more. But the Office of Foreign Assets Control, which is the smaller sanctions unit of Treasury, had been around for decades before 9/11, but it was seen as sort of an orphan of the Treasury Department. At least that's how one official from the time described the office to me. And then with 9/11, sanctions really pick up. And then in 2004, with the USA Patriot Act, the government created the Department of Homeland Security. And so it took parts of government from other agencies to create that. And so Treasury lost the Secret Service. So the guns and badges left the building. And one tiny little thing is that most cabinet officers are protected by like their own internal police. Only the president and the Treasury Secretary are protected by the Secret Service. And for Treasury, it's just because of that legacy that the Secret Service used to be part of Treasury. So TFI was created, the Terrorism and Financial Intelligence Unit, in 2004 to sort of oversee this broader network. And what we saw happen was that by, the early 2010s, Stuart Levy, who helped start TFI, who helped the Treasury Department get a seat at the intelligence community and national security table of the U.S. government and say, hey, no, these are all the very valid reasons Treasury needs to be at this table for decisions. He realized that when they went looking for Gaddafi's assets, he thought maybe we'll find maybe $10-20 million. And it turns out OFAC, in the course of 72 hours, was able to find $30 billion. And there's a moment that he's sitting there on one of his last days thinking, there's got to be a typo here. I didn't realize that we've had this power to track financial footprints across the global financial system and find this much money in such a short span of time.
So I want to get to kind of this incredible power that Treasury and OFAC ended up having. But sort of the stepping stone, and I think the thing that made people outside realize how powerful these tools could be, might be the Obama administration's use of sanctions on Iran in response to Iran's nuclear program. And for a lot of outside observers, that was a really successful use of sanctions. Iran agreed in 2015 to a deal in which it would exchange significant restrictions on its nuclear program for sanctions relief. But at the end of the Obama administration, there was a moment where basically there was a recalculation of, whether or not those sanctions had really worked as intended. And in particular, there was a speech that then Treasury Secretary Jack Lew made where he issued some warnings about the future use of sanctions. What was he worried about?
It's interesting. I started covering Treasury April of 2016, so Secretary Lew made that speech a month before I came, and throughout the Trump administration, which I covered, I found myself looking up that speech many, many times to the point where it was a bookmark on my browser, so I could find it quickly. I think I had printouts with highlights and things. So that was a fun chapter to write about. Jack Lew, this was, let's all kind of go back in time. We did not know that Trump would be elected. We did not know what Trump would do with sanctions. We did not know that Putin would invade, et cetera, necessarily the way he did. So he delivered a speech talking about how sanctions had become so powerful and so sophisticated. We've got when diplomacy fails in the past, the US has always gone to kinetic action, war. But since 9/11, the US had discovered this very vast and sophisticated space in between where when words fail and it's not time to spill blood, there is more we can do. And is powerful, but you cannot overuse it. Now, if you're coming from sort of the armed services side, you think, well, yeah, let's do that before we start spilling blood and spending billions on tanks, et cetera, et cetera. But Jack Lew wanted to say, let's not violate this tool because it will damage the US's interests. It will damage what the dollar can and can't do. And it was prescient. He almost foreshadowed that years down the line, it would take economic sanctions that the U.S. led. 30 countries came together. The U.S. led the sanctions against Russia in February of 2022. It was because of those sanctions, that action, that the de-dollarization conversation bubbled up again. It comes up every decade, but this time it's a little different. And Jack Lew called it.
So I want to get to the de-dollarization issue a little bit later and kind of trace that line through the Trump administration. But before we get there, I want to raise and sort of get your thoughts on another aspect of Lew's speech, where he was noting that it was also really important for the U.S. to be able to lift sanctions effectively when basically there had been some kind of agreement in which that was part of the bargain. And I remember that there was a really important meeting in, again, the spring of 2016 when Secretary John Kerry, Secretary of State, and Jack Lew came over to London and met with the leaders of a host of European banks. And basically, they were trying to convince those executives at those banks that now that secondary sanctions had been lifted on Iran, it was appropriate for their banks to do business with Iranian financial institutions. And a few days later, after that meeting, there was this extraordinary kind of op-ed in the Wall Street Journal where Stuart Levy basically wrote that under no conditions would HSBC, his bank, where he was chief legal officer at the time, be doing any business with Iran. And I mean, he basically told John Kerry and Jack Lew to pound sand. So what does that represent? I mean, what does it mean that you have a guy who was instrumental in developing sanctions now working in the private sector at a major bank? I mean, is it the case that you can have paper soldiers in financial institutions and not just in something like the Treasury Department?
Yeah, that debate was raging when I first got to DC in 2016, the whole stickiness of sanctions conversation. And I remember the main question that I would go out and ask when it came to sanctions at the time of current and former Treasury officials was, is the Treasury Secretary or the U.S. administration, are they refraining from giving the all clear to businesses to go trade and go into Iran? Are they refraining from that because they like the gray area that they are offered by saying, oh, you can go in, but we're not going to give you the all clear, meaning the effect of sanctions, the sting kind of stays there. And, I get mixed answers off the record. And on background, without anyone wanting to name it, they say yes. On the record, everyone says no. We're going to abide by the rules and what we said publicly about it being okay to trade with Iran. I think that there's a fair amount of work that goes on between the Treasury Department and the financial sector. A good Treasury Secretary has deep ties to financial institutions around the world. And so sanctions are kind of like they are farming out the work to the private sector to impose these restrictions. We've said, no, you have to go figure out who these people are and where it shows up in your plumbing, in the plumbing of your business and how it connects to the global financial system. So that partnership is important. you have to kind of wonder what kind of hushed conversations go on between these officials. They know each other well, if they're doing each other favors with these kinds of op-eds. But that stickiness of sanctions has been a conversation that has been ripe since then, I think. You're right.
And I mean, I guess Stuart Levy was right to be skeptical about where things were heading on Iran policy because, of course, a little over a year later, you had President Trump basically in office and very committed to tearing up the Iran nuclear deal and reimposing sanctions on Iran. And that really seemed to trigger a new phase in the development of sanctions as part of what Treasury does and as part of really how the US president shapes the world order. You write about how eventually the Trump administration was making 1,000 designations a year of different entities and individuals. But what's also interesting is that you have a new Treasury Secretary, Steven Mnuchin, who was for the first time willing to go back and look at Bob Rubin's strong dollar policy and question it, and was willing to state that maybe a weaker dollar would be in the US interest. And it struck me reading the book that you have this tension where in the Trump administration, you have an idea that maybe a weaker dollar in terms of, let's say, the exchange value of the dollar would be valuable for the US. But you also had an administration that was very committed to using kind of the weaponized dollar to advance its interests with different states, and Iran being maybe the best example. So is there a tension between having a weak dollar and a weaponized dollar? And how did you see that play out in the Trump administration?
I think there's two definitions to a strong dollar. The first has to do with the actual exchange rate. So how many Japanese yen or pound sterling or euros the dollar can buy at any given moment, kind of related to the laws of supply and demand in the market, what the foreign exchange rate is. And yes, since from Rubin until Trump, there was a preference for a stronger dollar because it meant more imports and it boosted the pillars of globalization. The other definition is a central dollar, a dominant dollar, meaning that the world literally runs on US dollars. It is strong because everyone needs it. It is strong because when times get tough, it is seen as a safe haven. It is strong because the world can rely on the U.S.'s ability to make good on all of its debt. And I think that if we're going to get to what was going on in the Trump administration and what's going on now, it's okay to have a preference or be accepting of a weaker exchange rate, but still want dollar hegemony because it's two different. You're tapping into the two different definitions of strong, and ultimately, and this is something that really came to light for me when I interviewed Hank Paulson for the book. Ultimately, if the U.S. itself is strong, the economy is strong, then that is good for the world because the global economy grows when the U.S. economy grows. We're the largest economy. And if for a little while a weaker currency is preferred in order to maintain that, then there shouldn't be anything wrong with that.
So Steven Mnuchin was navigating a lot of things during the Trump administration, internal politics related to the administration, the relations that the U.S. had with different countries around the world, with European allies, with China. But one of the things that really struck me, and similarly to you, during the Trump years, I kept going back to the Jack Lew speech and, had it basically bookmarked as well, was that towards the end of the administration, Steven Mnuchin seemed to have some of the same concerns around the overuse of sanctions and what it might do to the ability to navigate that sort of dichotomy of what dollar strength is. And you point this out in the book, and you sort of highlight that Mnuchin ended up being a little bit of a voice of restraint and caution when it comes to the dollar. So what was it that sort of drove him to arrive at the same conclusions that Jack Lew did? And is it something that every Treasury Secretary goes through as a part of the learning curve?
I think you hit it on the nose there. It is something that every secretary goes through because they are the steward of the world's reserve asset, and that is a big responsibility, and it affects their legacy and the legacy of the dollar and the country in that sense. When Mnuchin would talk about it, he was thinking and looking beyond just sanctions. He also faced a president who wanted to aggressively intervene in in the exchange rate market to weaken the dollar for political gain. And so he saw that this much tampering with the country's national treasure was not going to be good, and that included the using sanctions again and again or threatening sanctions again and again. So Mnuchin came to it with a slightly different angle, and then Janet Yellen came to that same sort of crossroads as well. So the job of the Treasury Secretary, that's why I say that, the cat and mouse game between journalists and Treasury secretaries on talking about the dollar, asking about the dollar. It's persisted for decades. I write about that in the book a little bit. And also with for Treasury secretaries to protect the dollar just internally in their own administrations has persisted because it's very easy for someone from the intelligence community or Defense Department or someone over, in the armed services to say, well, let's just sanction them. But it's up to Treasury to say, let's not overdo it because then these sanctions won't have bite.
So we've talked about the idea that Treasury secretaries have a learning curve, but maybe Janet Yellen did her homework before she, waited until the end of her time in Biden's first term to really come to these conclusions, because you describe this really extraordinary sort of interaction in the Situation Room when the U.S. was really devising its response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. And you write about how, because the U.S. had ruled out using boots on the ground in response to the Russian invasion, that really left sanctions as the key thing that the U.S. could put forward to say, look, we're dealing with this seriously and we're trying to restrain or let's say constrain Russia's means to wage the war. But in the course of those deliberations, Janet Yellen basically asked for more time from the White House in order to evaluate the possible impact of the sanctions that they were recommending because of how extensive they were, and of course because of the sort of systemically important role that the Russian economy had in the global economy. What does it mean that Yellen was able to sort of identify these possible risk factors so early? And where do you think we've ended up now where, of course, the sanctions have remained the dominant way in which the U.S. has responded to the Russian invasion, and we're still sort of trying to understand what the implications are for the global economy writ large?
One thing that's been going on in the backdrop to all of this is that the American electorate's appetite for actual war, kinetic action, has dropped. There was the Iraq War, everything that came of that. And then the latest blow was August of 2021, the U.S.'s withdrawal from Afghanistan. And it kind of just became apparent to Americans that war, it's not working. And so I think the U.S., the White House, when the Russian invasion began, it was clear that the White House would not have a mandate for kinetic action. And that is something that I think Jack Lew and others Treasury secretaries have seen too. Well, okay, if we are going to be going into other countries aggressively, like with guns and military tanks and stuff less, then okay, everyone's going to start looking at sanctions to see what we can do there, right? Janet Yellen, she realized in that moment that that is one of her most important jobs, is to protect the dollar from overuse and over-weaponization. But also with that is also the U.S. as the sort of overseer of the global financial system has a responsibility to punish bad actors when they use the global financial system for malign activities. So that's like a real tension of we don't want to weaponize the dollar too much, but actually you can't use it for bad things if it's disrupting global peace in this way. So there's a real tension there, and it played out in the Situation Room that day, that morning, or over a couple of days, and it was pretty dramatic. And I think any good decision that's coming out of the government, you're going to have. You should, as a citizen, as a civilian, you want that people in that room have different views, so that whoever's making the decision has heard everything. So we're fortunate to always have treasury secretaries who are trying to think from a different perspective. Um, and she was right. It made sure that she and the Treasury Department and the White House were prepared then for the big shift toward the de-dollarization conversation, which I will say is more words than action, but it's still meaningful and should be paid attention to.
So you do point to sort of an uncertain future towards the end of the book where, there is this conversation around de-dollarization, and I tend to agree with you that it's more words than action. But there are a handful of countries that I think are increasingly skeptical about whether a strong dollar is in their interest, because, of course, it gives the US this extraordinary power to, without putting too much skin in the game, shape global events by using sort of these financial weapons. So we have, for example, Russia and Iran, which are now two large economies under major US sanctions programs. There's been a lot of talk about their cooperation, both materially and potentially financially, to try and circumvent US sanctions. And then you've had this, really interesting kind of evolution of rhetoric from the Biden administration about China, where you have folks in the White House often being very explicit about the desire to limit China's access to certain technologies. And then you also have, of course, people like Janet Yellen sent to Beijing. I think she's heading to Beijing again soon in order to try and keep things calm and maintain some stability to the China-US relationship. So when you think about where we are now, Secretary Yellen was very concerned in the Situation Room that this was going to upend the sort of role of the U.S. in the global economy. We are a couple years down the line. Treasury is still concerned, I assume, but do they also see it mostly as words and not yet really concrete challenges to dollar dominance?
What I find interesting is that the US is in a defensive posture now when it comes to the dollar. Now you hear Janet Yellen and her, senior officials saying, well, there's no threat, and plus there's no alternative. The minute you're saying, well, there's no one else, you're on the defense. And I think that's an interesting shift. I don't, I start and end the book with saying that we don't know if the sanctions of February 24th, 2020, or the 26th, 2022 will be the ultimate date that the shift began. There is still time to recover it. We've got years and years of that, but all eyes are on the U.S. to see how that plays out. I think that people talk about the BRICS Plus coming together and the China-led coalition that includes Russia coming together and de-dollarizing, reducing their exposure. But we're seeing examples of how in reality that's not working. There was some data on the Bloomberg terminal recently that Russian companies that were issuing their local debt in yuan don't see enough liquidity. And that's one reason that the dollar has just been so central, because there's always liquidity. There's an insatiable appetite to buy dollars, to trade dollars. I think the other thing to look at when we're looking at the foreign picture is that these countries that are talking about reducing dollar exposure, one, there's nothing wrong with a little bit of a plateau in that power, but also they are not necessarily run with open and free and fair democracies the way the US is. And so if at some point power changes, as it does when, someone's life comes to a close, the curtains drop, and then there's a power struggle, there's a power vacuum, and then are they going to have time to deal with their bilateral trade relationship in a different currency, or are they going to be dealing with political instability? I end the book, yes, with some uncertainty, but hopeful uncertainty. I actually think that the biggest threats to the dollar and where it's headed in terms of weaponization and the strength and power of sanctions, since I'm on the Sanctions Age podcast, I think all of that actually comes the biggest threat is internal. If we, the world relies on the dollar and the US as a superpower because we have rule of law and free and fair elections and independent agencies and courts who have high ethical standards. But if each one of those pillars starts to be questioned and there are chinks in the armor then the dollar and the US's reign is not going to be able to withstand that. So we're a democracy. We're in a very self-critical moment right now. We have recovered from worse. So I'm hopeful. I do end on a note from. I end the book on a note from a 4-decade veteran of the Treasury Department and dollar policy, Mark Sobel, who says when he is asked about dollar policy and what's going to happen to the U.S. and the dollar, he says, "The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves." And that's a line from Shakespeare.
And I mean, I think that's brilliant because it also brings us back to Bob Rubin. And I was really sort of struck in listening to your conversation on another podcast, Odd Lots, Bloomberg podcast, where you told Joe and Tracy that one of the motivations in writing this book was really responding to an op-ed that Bob Rubin wrote, if I recall correctly, after the January 6th storming of the Capitol. And he writes in that op-ed that faith in democracy and faith in markets go hand in hand. And you just outlined for us that part of the reason to be skeptical about those that might want to supplant the dollar is that even if they have currencies, they may not have the democracies that give their markets transparency and structure and accountability. Where do you think we are now as we head into a contentious election? You mentioned that, the bigger threats are domestic in the U.S. How do you think global investors are looking at our market? And how do you think that the civil servants in Treasury are going to navigate the complicated political landscape ahead of them?
I think the eyes are on the U.S. Right now to see how we pull through from the current elections and how our democracy pulls through. There is sort of this feeling that the U.S. electorate in the end always does the right thing. But like I said, part of being in a democracy and having a democracy is that it can get nasty and all the self-criticism and blame and everything plays out in front of everyone. And that's just, we're in the midst of it. So we almost can't see our way out in the fog of war. So eyes are definitely on us. I have immense amount of hope. I think it's going to come down to, we're not the only ones voting this year. 4 billion people around the world go to their local elections. And so that's a big moment for the world. But I think that we won't know for a while, I think, whether we're in the midst of a permanent shift and we won't know for a while if we've actually avoided that permanent shift to the America's benefit.
And do you have any indicator that you're going to keep an eye out for when there might be a permanent shift? I mean, what should people be watching out for?
I think I'm going to be curious that the next time that there is a crisis, however small or large, whether the U.S. is still seen as a safe haven. Because anytime, global pandemic, the global financial crisis, which was American-made, even then, people still fled to U.S. treasuries and to the dollar for safety. When there are local crises, if the leader of a country somewhere else in the world there's a political coup or there's political instability, investors flee to the dollar. Emerging markets issue their local debt in dollars. So I think I'm going to wait to see the next even small regional crisis. If I see that the dollar remains a safe haven asset, I think we're safe. We're good.
So, Saleha, we've reached the end of our time, so I have to ask you the final question that we ask all of our guests. And the question is, when did you realize that sanctions are changing the world?
I think it's when my mom started talking about sanctions because she's not in this world at all. She lives in Cincinnati, Ohio, and has nothing to do with economic policy or foreign policy. She is just a avid consumer of news and foreign policy objectives and what's going on, current events. And when she started talking to me 2 years ago in 2022 about economic sanctions and will they work and remember what happened to Iran, I thought, okay, this is a big deal. And just a couple of weeks later, Joe Biden, in his first State of the Union address, which is technically called a joint sessions, he mentioned economic sanctions. No, in his second address, he mentioned it in the first couple of minutes of his State of the Union remarks when he's speaking to the American people. So I think that really just brought it into the mainstream.
When the moms are talking about it, you know it's a big issue.
Yeah.
So, Saleha, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me, and congratulations on really what was an excellent book. I enjoyed reading it.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be on.
I'm Esfandyar Batmanghelidj, and this has been The Sanctions Age. Our show is produced by Spiritland Productions and is supported by a grant from the Hollings Center for International Dialogue. Thanks for listening.